Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 8, and this lesson we're going to be covering MySQL as a data access source. So let's go to Visual Studio. We're going to start the same way as before. We're going to create a new console application. So new project, console application, or .NET Core. We're going to call this MySQL UI. And let's do a lowercase for SQL. There we go. So now we're going to set this up like before. So let's add our app settings.json. So new item, JSON, and call it app settings.json. And we'll come down here. Oh, before we forget, properties, copy. That's one of those things I'll forget if I'm not careful. Let's go to here and let's just copy this structure and paste it in here so we have a structure we can take out the connection string. And we'll figure that out in a bit. But now we have a connection string. And now let's set this as a startup project. And going over to our SQLite UI program, let's just copy everything in here because I think we're going to need it all. And we don't copy those last two curly braces. And let's paste it in here. We do need to add the dependency on the NuGet package for our JSON, which that was not that one. Here we go. Dependencies, manage NuGet packages. It's microsoft.extensions.configuration.json. So microsoft.extensions.configuration.json. Install that. This is where the command line for the package manager is easier in some ways. Because if you already have that, you can kind of script it or do it over again. Okay, so we have configuration builder down here. We can do control dot, add our using statement there. Control dot on directory to add our using statement. And that takes care of this. We're going to get errors on a few of these. Let's change the model to allow that. Add a reference to data access library and add the using statement. And let's do this. Let's leave all the rest alone. Let's comment out this one. And let's change this to say MySQL. So we still have errors, but they're all about SQLite CRUD, which we don't have SQLite CRUD, or we don't want to use SQLite CRUD. We want to use MySQL CRUD, which doesn't exist yet. So we've got it set up, though, the way that kind of as a starting point versus what we had with SQLite or with SQL Server. So now let's go to our data access library. And we haven't set up a database yet, but let's do our code. We have SQL data access and SQLite data access. Guess what? MySQL data access is really, really close. So MySQL data access. And we have for SQLite data access, we're going to copy that and make this public and paste this in here, but it's not quite right because this SQLite connection, that's going to be an issue. So add a using statement there, and we'll need a toList. We'll need a link. So using system.link, and we'll need a using for Dapper. So we're all set here except for this SQLite connection. So let's go to the dependencies, manage NuGet packages, and search for MySQL.data. We get this right here, MySQL.data from the MySQL organization. We can install that. We can close it down once we've accepted the terms. And now instead of SQLite connection, we can say this is the MySQL connection. control dot to add a using statement. And now our data access class will work. Everything else is the same. It's just MySQL connection versus SQLite connection versus SQL connection. Okay? So all we need now is a MySQL CRUD. So let's add a new class. We're going to call it MySQL CRUD. Make it public. And let's copy the SQLite CRUD. Beyond that, I think that everything else should work. Because it looks like we're just taking in that, or using that DB, which is a MySQL data access. Now, select ID from contacts. We're going to make sure that works with the new system, but otherwise, this data access layer is the same. So now over here, we can say MySQL CRUD. Control dot to add that using statement. And then we have to change everywhere we're passing it in to say MySQL CRUD instead of SQLite CRUD. Okay. And now I believe we have no errors. We build this, build succeeds. Excellent. Now it won't run yet because we don't have a database. And we also don't have a connection string, which makes sense because we have no database. So let's start by making sure you have MySQL installed. Now you can get MySQL on a server somewhere and just connect to it if you want, or you can install it locally. If you want to install it locally, you're going to go to mysql.com. Now the Enterprise Edition is not free. However, there is a free Community Edition. So you can go to Downloads, and if you look down here, it says MySQL Community Download. Click that and choose the download that works for you. Most likely, it's something like MySQL Installer for Windows. Okay, once you install that, make sure that you have the MySQL Workbench. If you don't, so if you didn't install it with the main database, or if you're using an external database and didn't install anything, you go to Products. Under Enterprise Edition, you have Workbench. Download now. Install the MySQL Workbench. That's going to be what you want to work with it visually. And it's available on Windows, Linux, and Mac. Okay? So once those two are installed and running, then you're going to get something like this in the MySQL Workbench. You're going to connect to your database, okay, or your server. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is come up here and say create new schema in the connected server. And our schema that we use, let's make sure I get this right. It's going to be MySQL, I believe it was contacts DB. Okay, and hit apply. And it's going to create that for us. We hit apply. And it says there's a parsing error. Let's view the DDL. And now it says finished. Okay, so I'm not quite sure why we had an error there. It looks like it worked. All right, looks like there's a bug there, but It seems to be working. So let's proceed as if it is working. Create a new table, and we'll say contacts. And the first column name is going to be ID. That's an int, primary key, not null. And we're going to select the auto incrementing. And then we're going to have a first name. This does have a varchar option. So there's a lot of different options here. We're going to choose, let's go with nvarchar, and so that's what we did before. Nvarchar of type 50. And we're going to say not null. And last name, and that's nvarchar 50. Oops, it's not like in my typing. Int, and that is the auto incrementing. So it's primary key, not null, and auto incrementing. And we're going to say that this is email address, and that is, I believe, just a varchar, and it was 100. I don't believe we did nvarchar for that. And we did say it was not null. Okay? And we can apply that. And now I can create another table. And this is the phone numbers table, which has an ID, which is an int, primary key, and not null, and auto incrementing. It's got a phone number column. And that was, I believe, we did varchar 20 for that. And we did say it was not null. Okay, hit apply. Hit apply. Finish. Now we have 3 tables. We need 2 more. We need our linking tables. So we'll start with contact email, which that starts off with an ID. That's a primary key, not null, auto incrementing value. And then we have a contact ID, and that is also an int, and it is not null. And we have our email address ID, also an integer, and also not null. You can hit apply on that. Close that out. And our last table, create table, and this is the contact phone numbers. Make sure you're spelling things right, otherwise it won't line up with our previous code. ID, int, primary key, auto incrementing, contact ID, and this is an int and not null. And this is phone number ID, also an int and also not There we go. That's better. Values, Tim, Corey. All right. We hit execute on that. Now this execute, just like in SQL Server, whatever you highlight is what it will execute. If you don't highlight anything, it will execute everything. Okay, and we get the no database selected. We need to select a database. We can do that by double-clicking its name in the schemas list. Okay, so we double-click the name of MySQL contacts, and now if we run this again, we get this green that was successful. And if we do select rows, we'll see we have Tim Corey, an ID of 1. Now let's add a couple of records for email addresses and phone numbers. So insert into email addresses. And this is email address. Values, me at Timothy. Actually, the first one was Tim at IamTimCorey. Tim at IamTimCorey.com. And comma, me at TimothyCorey.com. Like so. What that's going to do is do 2 inserts. It'll insert this value and then this value. Run that. It's now been inserted. If we look at email addresses, we'll see we have 2, Tim and me. And yes, it's a little small, and it's going to be clearing out the screen when I select it. Sorry about that. Okay, let's go back to here. And we're going to do the same insert statement, but for phone numbers. Phone number, values, and the first one is 555-1212. You have to close out the parens to say that's a complete statement, and then do a comma, and the next set of parens. This works for SQL Server as well. 555-1234. Whoops, that's a dash, not a dot. Not that it really matters, but I try to be consistent. And you run this, and that works as well, and it should be they have values 1 and 2, which we do. Which means now we can do our inserts into the connection table. So we have contact email, which is contact ID, email address ID, values, and we have our contact ID is 1, our email address is 1, and then we have another one, 1 and 2. So it's going to link my account, my contact record, with email addresses 1 and 2. We run that. That worked. And we'll do the same thing for contact phone numbers. And this would be the phone number ID. But it's the same numbers because we put them in order. So we can run that, and that worked as well. So now we have all of our setup data done. Okay, so let's go over now to our database. We're almost ready to run, or our code. We're almost ready to run, but we have one thing left to do, and that's our connection string. What is our connection string? Well, let's go to connectionstrings.com and come down here and look for MySQL. In MySQL, you have a couple different versions, but the standard one will most likely work for you. It won't work for me because I have a different port that mine is on. Therefore, I copy this one right here. Okay? And I'm going to paste it in place. And let's, so it gave me a line return there. I don't want that line return. So let's get rid of that. There we go. So now you have, there we go. So you have server is the server address, which for me is localhost. The port for me normally is 3306, but mine is 13306. Okay, the database is MySQL contacts DB. And the username for me is root. Now, some of you may be freaking out right now because I'm going to put a password in this box. And I'm actually going to copy the password. First of all, this should be a development-only password, not a password for production. In production, what you do is you would replace this with something like Key Vault or with something else like that where it's encrypted, it's on a server, you can't get access to it. But for development, writing it right in appsettings.json is the way to go. Okay? So there we go. My username, my password, and that should be all we need to connect. Let's do a read all contacts. It is set as the startup project. Let's see if this works. We've done a lot of typing. We haven't done a lot of testing yet. Let's see if it works. Okay, we have an access denied. And I think I actually know why. I actually changed my password. This is one of those things that I copied it and I thought I was going to use it, but that's a really complicated password. I believe I changed this to my normal. If we update the contact and read, let's do that. There we go, Timothy Corey instead of Tim Corey, and we have Charity Corey as well. So now the last one is let's remove Tim from having that 5551212 entry, but we'll leave Charity having that, so just one person has it, okay? And now if we go back to our MySQL workbench, we can kind of browse through and make sure that what we saw is really true. So contact phone numbers. I removed Tim from having the 5551212. Therefore, we start at entry 2, not at entry 1. Okay? So we've removed that one record, but in phone numbers, all three are still there because Charity still uses what used to be our shared number. Okay? So that's all there is to MySQL. So I get this question a lot, well, how do I do it with X? You know, with SQLite and MySQL come up a lot as opposed to just SQL Server. And I tend to do SQL Server because that's the primary database for C#. It's kind of like, you know, they go together. But really, when you're using Dapper especially, it doesn't really matter which database engine you choose. If you're choosing a relational database, it's going to work pretty much the same way. So I chose the top 3 relational databases. We have SQL, we have SQLite, and we have MySQL. And the code is all the same. So the only difference between SQL that I did versus SQLite and MySQL is I used the schema DBO dot. And if I didn't do that, it still would have worked. And then there'd be no changes in the CRUD. It would just be which are they calling, which means that we could refactor this application. I would love you to try. Refactor this application so that in the beginning you choose which version of a database you want to save to. Is it SQL? Is it SQLite? Or is it MySQL? All the rest of the code stays the same. It's just which version of the database do you want to save to. And then based upon that, it points to the correct data access. So you need to use an interface and say I data access, and it has a load data and a save data, but everything else stays the same, and you just insert whichever one you want because the CRUD is exactly the same, or pretty close to exactly the same. There's a minor tweak for SQL when I have the DBO dot. And maybe you figure out how to abstract that out. Dapper has a lot more different platforms it can talk to besides just our 3 relational databases we chose. But these are the top 3 that you'll most likely encounter when working with C#. And so I wanted to make sure we got those out and saw the differences, saw how to create databases, saw how to connect to them, how to read and write from them. And now that you've seen that, we're going to move on to a different type of database in the next section, and that is the NoSQL database. So that's what's coming up in the next section. Okay, but until then, let's look at today's tip for today. And that is, remember to customize your design to your database type. Each type is different. So while we didn't see a whole lot of differences on the C# side, there were some differences on the database side. Remember that SQLite had just text, where SQL and MySQL had a number of different options for text. So, char, nvarchar, or varchar, and those. Now, one of the things you have to remember is that your database type is different even if it has the same names. So how MySQL treats an nvarchar may be a little bit different than SQL. All right, so you do need to know your database and not just assume that if the names are the same, then it acts the same, or it's optimized the same way. Because database optimization is very, very important. That's where you get your speed from, is if you do things in an optimal way for that database, it'll be more efficient, and you'll get data out faster and get data in faster. So you got to know your database types when you're using them. You can't just assume that it's an apples to apples thing, even though, as you saw in code, the code side of it seems like it's pretty much the same thing. You'll find differences when you come into things like dates or storing some more edge case things. But really, under the covers, each database is different and it reacts differently. And you need to treat it differently by knowing how it works, not just knowing the bare minimum to operate it. Okay? So definitely learn more about your database than just what to use it for. Okay? Learn how it works so you know better how to talk to it. Okay, so the homework is one you've already done a couple times now. This time we're going to do it in MySQL. So build a sample database in MySQL that holds people, addresses, and employers. And make sure it builds and you can load and save data in C#. Again, this is just so you practice building a MySQL database, getting MySQL up and running. You're going to come into some issues with that. And working through those issues is going to help you grow your knowledge. And working through how do you talk to it and what commands to run, how to look out for those missing, a semicolon or something like that. Those type of issues you run into are what's going to grow your skills. Just watching what I do and seeing how it works isn't going to grow your skills as much. You got to do it yourself and get your hands on it. Okay? So try it out with MySQL. Once you've done that, come on back for the next video in this series.